Good morning. I'm currently serving as the Deputy Legal Advisor at U.S. Pacific Command here in Hawaii, and I came to know John in the past 3 years as we traveled around and spoke at various international forums, both here at the East-West Center, as well as the law school, and then elsewhere in the Pacific, as well as out in Canada. In John's 68 years on this earth, he touched so many lives. I learned that as I read all the reports in the newspaper and the tributes and the letters to the editor over the past month. I saw this narrow sliver of John's professional life, and that is how he was respected in the international community for international law. So as we work collectively at this point this morning to kind of paint a portrait of John, I've got four strokes to paint. First, John was highly respected in the field of international law. You've heard that from others, but I can't stress it enough. I really can't. Many of you knew John for his life here in Hawaii. You knew that he traveled a lot, and some of you might have thought that's a really lucky guy that he's got a modest professor's salary and he's getting to see the world on the cheap. What I saw was him in that international setting. In fact, John and I were oftentimes the only two Americans in the room at these events. And from the very first one of these events, what I saw was how respected he was among this cast of international colleagues. On more than one occasion, and I can't emphasize this enough, while there was some sort of discussion or debate going on about an issue, one of the scholars would turn to John and say, "Professor Van Dyke, what do you think about this?" John was like the E.F. Hutton of international law. People stopped and listened to hear what he had to say. Which brings me to my second point, and that is, due to John's solid professional reputation, John leaves behind a legacy of high-quality scholarship that will have an enduring effect for many years to come. And to this, I want to emphasize two examples. A year after the nations concluded the Law of the Sea Convention in 1982, John organized and hosted a conference here in Hawaii about the intended meaning and the future impact of that convention. And he invited many of the key delegates from those nations that helped negotiate it. He invited them here to Hawaii, and the conference was held in this building. And after the conference was over, John published one of his books, which has been referenced earlier. The book's almost 30 years old now. It was published in 1984. And as I read up on the Law of the Sea on almost a daily basis, I can't tell you how many times that book is footnoted by scholars everywhere. And I decided, it's 30 years old, but maybe I should try to get a copy of this book. So the day before John passed, and he was in Australia for the conference, I emailed him. And I said, "Hey, can I get a copy of that book? They're just not on the shelf. They don't sell them at the bookstore here." And he said, "Sure, when I get back to Hawaii, I'll track you down a copy and we'll get it to you." In the week after his death, I decided I'd get online and shuck out the $30 and not be a cheapskate, and buy a copy of that book and kind of read it as an intellectual tribute to John. So that's what I did over the Christmas holidays. I read that book. Some of you may say I'm a geek, but John was a geek too. So, some have called the Law of the Sea Convention a constitution of the oceans. And as I read that book over the holidays, I felt like I was reading John interview the framers of the Constitution and asking them these penetrating questions of, what did you mean about this provision? Why did you use that language? And here they were telling him the answers. And this was less than a year after the convention was concluded. And I can just envision John feverishly taking down all of these responses in the interest of kind of capturing the original intent of that international constitution for global posterity. Fast forward 15 years after he published that book, and another one of the books which was referenced earlier is a book that John wrote about the South China Sea situation. Many Americans, when we talk about the South China Sea these past few years and the disputes that go on there, think that they see it in the news and they think it's new. But the people of the Asia-Pacific region know that those disputes are not new. Some are many, many, many centuries old. And John, as a resident of the Asia-Pacific region, he also knew that they were not new. And so when he worked together and published that book in 1997, identifying a lot of the issues and proposing a roadmap of solutions, the book's just as good today as it was when he wrote it 15 years ago. And at the conferences we go to with Sherry and others, that book is constantly referenced. People want to get a copy of it. I remember he came with a cardboard box of them one time to one conference, and that was when he gave me my copy. And I looked at it the other morning, and it said, "With Aloha, John," inscribed inside. And for that kind of legal scholarship, not just for those two books, but so much more that he wrote, I, as part of that international legal community, am grateful. And third, as we've seen in so many of the other speakers today, John contributed that intellect and that scholarship that he had and his energy to advance so many causes. Yet, as I tried to distill them down, what is it that all of those causes have in common? And when you boil them all down, John's true cause was for upholding the rule of law. His efforts involved many subjects of law, some domestic, some international. And regardless, John vigorously and rigorously challenged others to join him in upholding the transparency, the consistency, and the equality of the law. Of note, John could advocate for the rule of law in multiple unrelated situations almost simultaneously. About a year ago, John and Sherry and I went to D.C. and we spoke together. John invited me to speak on a panel at the Council on Foreign Relations, which was quite a treat for somebody of my low level. And the subject of the panel was China and the rule of law and law of the sea. We had a productive roundtable discussion with a senior level audience. And for a moment, I felt like this elbow-patched law professor, some of you have called a hippie, and his Navy JAG sidekick were singing a similar tune about concerns over the Chinese perspective on international rule of law. As we walked out of the building, I asked John and Sherry what they were doing for the remainder of their day before they flew back to Hawaii. And John told me that they were headed over to meet with an environmental law advocacy group in town, a group that I knew had sued the Navy in the past. As I got in my car, my rental car, that's all I could do was chuckle. John was perfectly able to intellectually compartmentalize and share the stage with a Navy lawyer on one common cause for the rule of law and continue helping other legal causes in which he believed. And I respected that. And fourth and finally, I'll close on a more personal observation of what my relationship with John meant to me. In short, John was the professor of international law that I never had. I know some, and many of you, as we saw everyone stand up, was touched by John as one of their law professors, whether it's in the past few years or it was decades ago. When I started law school almost 20 years ago, I knew that I wanted to be a labor and employment lawyer. I knew. So those of you who are still in law school, be careful what you know you want to do in your career. So as a result, I took every possible labor and employment law elective during law school. By the time I was on the verge of graduating from law school and I decided to join the Navy, which I told my wife was going to be 3 years, she reminds me of that, it was too late to take a course in international law. Thus, over the past 16 years of my Navy career, 95% of what I've learned about international law has either been self-taught or on the job. When I first arrived here in Hawaii 3 years ago, I'd practiced maritime law in Washington at the Pentagon. And when I arrived, I'd heard that John was the maritime law expert here at the law school. And soon thereafter, I didn't reach out to John. John reached out to me. He invited me to speak on a panel about the impeccable incident involving the U.S. Navy ship and 5 Chinese vessels in the South China Sea. And after that, our professional relationship grew. And as I said earlier, John and I were oftentimes the only Americans in the room at these international settings. And when I completed my presentations on these panels, the floor would open for questions. And as other speakers have said today, John asked penetrating questions, and I was not immune to them. It was always the hardest question of the lot that I got. I did my best to answer them, but John never responded or reacted to my answers. Thus, I never knew precisely where I stood in John's intellectual eyes. I think they call that the Socratic method, right? In fact, in that same email that we shared the day before John died, John not only offered me a copy of the book, but he also renewed an invitation for me to come and teach a couple of sessions of his maritime law class this spring. A month before John's passing, he and I were speaking at a South China Sea conference in Vietnam. One day during the conference, we sat together at lunch in the hotel, and we had one of the most personal conversations that we've ever shared. Doesn't rise to the level of some of his closest friends, but it was personal by my standard. I told him I was coming up for orders this coming summer and that I didn't know where I was going, and I told him the several jobs that were possibilities. And when I told him that one of those jobs was as an oceans policy advisor for the Secretary of Defense, John chimed in and said, "You need to go to the Pentagon and take that job. I think you represent our country very well." Upon hearing of the news of John's death, I immediately reflected upon that remark John had made to me less than a month earlier. All of those conferences, John, ever the teacher, had been teaching me how to be a better international lawyer. And now, looking back, such a simple compliment over lunch from a pillar of America's international law community and from the son of a career diplomat was the best grade I shall ever receive from a law professor, and I will always treasure it. Centuries ago, there was an Englishman named Sir Thomas More. As some of you may recall, More was an English lawyer, a social philosopher, an author, a statesman, and a noted Renaissance humanist. He was a man of conscience who was willing to stand up for what he believed in the world of his time. An historian once described him as the first great Englishman whom we feel that we know, the most saintly of humanists, the most human of saints, the universal man of our cool Northern Renaissance. Centuries later, a play was written of Sir Thomas More's life, and Hollywood turned it into a movie, both entitled A Man for All Seasons. Today, we remember another man of conscience, a man with an unwavering faith in the rules of law that govern how we relate to each other, to our governments, and to other nations. With John's love for the oceans, his vigilance for so many causes, his deep intellect, his gentle and friendly disposition to everyone he met, perhaps it would be fitting for us to remember John today as a man for all seas. On behalf of all of the Navy lawyers here in Hawaii and in Washington and at the Naval War College in Newport who have contacted me and extended their best wishes to you, I close by extending our deepest JAG Corps sympathies to Sherry, to John's children, and the rest of John's family. He was an intellectual gentleman, and he will be missed. Thank you.